broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Wes Huffman, the Executive Director of the AOBA Educational Foundation, and we are very pleased to bring this event to you along with the Building of Innovation Hub and of course our friends at the parent AOBA. AOBA is very well represented on this panel today, and I'm very pleased to see that. Before we dive into things, let me just go ahead and cover a few housekeeping items. All of your lines will be muted during the broadcast. You can type in your questions in the Q&A. And Lindsay Falaska will be reading those as we go along. Alexander Laney, the Senior Communications Manager at IMT, is on point if anyone has any sort of technical issues, that sort of thing. She will be there to assist. And the event is being recorded and will be available on the Hub's website in the coming day, maybe this week or early next week. So look for that as well as a follow-up email on the event. And with that, I'll go ahead and just start and talk a little bit about the AOBA Educational Foundation, AOBA, and the AOBA Alliance, and our interest in the BEPS issue and these the discussion we're having today. The Educational Foundation was initially created to help build pipelines for career pathways for building engineers and maintenance on the apartment side, or building engineers on the commercial side. And we ran an internship program for 2 years to introduce people to this field. We have a pressing need in this line of work. Obviously, 2020 was a little bit of a different year in terms of running internships and trying to get people involved into the program, or into a career. We're just in a bit of a pause right now in that regard. But we also look to help engineers, with professional development and professional growth, as at AOBA member companies. And so that's how we ended up becoming involved with the Hub. As part of their launch, they put together numerous resources for owners and operators to meet, new energy standards. And one of those was an operations and maintenance guide built for engineers that we at the foundation contributed heavily to, and we hope that you guys find to be a really great resource. Importantly, I'd like to say that resource, it's a starting point. It is not applicable to your individual building, but it does start, and it starts about talking about a culture of efficiency, and it does a deep dive into building components, but it's very much supposed to be, you take that information and think about it a bit, and then tailor it to your individual buildings. As far as our discussion today, I was just so thrilled to when Lindsay asked me to join in, because it's two topics that you don't necessarily think of that go hand in hand in the sense of BEPS and kind of the COVID response. You say, well, those things are almost in tension with each other because of all the air we're pumping through buildings and whatnot. But if you think about it and you think about long-term planning, you can see how these two things do come together. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Lindsay and Jackie and Eric to kind of see how those things tie together. But before we do that, I think we need to get kind of a table set on where we are with the BEPS process, and that's where we have Joe Riley of Ackridge, who is the General Manager of Asset Services at Ackridge. He is responsible for the overall management, performance, and operation of commercial office buildings within their portfolio. And in 2019, he was named to the BEPS task force as AOBA's representative. So thanks to Joe for providing an update. I won't steal his thunder. I will just say that right now we're at the Tom Petty phase of the regulatory process. The waiting is the hardest part for those of you who aren't big Petty fans, and I'm looking forward to his presentation. Before I hand it over to Joe, I got to get one last thank you in real quick, and that's to the folks at the AOBA Alliance who have been doing yeoman's work on behalf of AOBA on these BEPS related issues, and that includes Kevin Carey and Seth Caldwell. The Alliance is another affiliated entity with AOBA. It's our energy kind of affiliate, and they have been just doing some fantastic work in addition to Joe's work on as our actual representative. And with that long-winded introduction, I will go ahead and pass it off to Joe to give us the BEPS update for today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Wes. You're right. The folks at AOBA, Kevin everybody, they deserve credit. I just kind of show up to the meetings. BEPS, what is it? What will compliance mean? What's the timing? Glad you asked. I'm going to quickly review a few slides, give you some of the basics, and give you some of the updates. But before we start, it's important to just remember what this is all about. BEPS is about climate change. It's about reducing greenhouse gases. It's about saving the planet. Mayor Muriel Bowser and the DC Council have a vision to get the district to carbon neutrality by 2050. To get there, they developed a plan. That plan, the idea kind of is, if any city in the world is going to lead the world towards like this carbon neutrality, why not the district? Why not now? And so that plan resulted in a major climate change bill. Next slide. We got the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act of 2018. So this act had like 5 major pieces, including a net zero requirement for new construction, a 100% renewable energy requirement. But the part of the plan that actually saves the most greenhouse gases is BEPS, and that's the DOEE, the Department of Energy and Environment, has to implement a building energy performance standard, BEPS. Next slide. Before we get to BEPS, it's important to keep in mind, as every property manager in DC already knows, we're required to submit our Energy Star performance to DOE by April 1st each year. Per this 2018 law, over the next couple of years, it's going to pick up buildings over 25,000 square feet and 10,000 square feet as well. BEPS takes that data and does something with it. The next slide, please. The law requires that DOEE establish a minimum threshold that will be no lower than the local median Energy Star score by property type. So to understand BEPS, we really just need to break that down. The property type part is easy. Office is going to be compared to office, hotels compared to hotels, and so on for multifamily, mixed use, police stations, schools, etc. The local median part makes it harder. Local means DC, right, in the district. Since DC's buildings are already higher performing on average than the national average, this really raises the bar about what BEPS in DC means. For example, in 2018, the median score for office in the district was 68. DOE hasn't published the 2019 data yet, and that 2019 data is what they're going to use to set these thresholds. But we expect the threshold for office to be around 71 and around 67 for multifamily. So the way this will work is DOE will compare your 2019 score that you submitted earlier this year against the threshold. All buildings under that threshold will be on the list and need to comply. This means that half the buildings in the city are going to be on the compliance list. Then after a 6-year period, we go from BEPS 1 to BEPS 2. DOEE will crunch the numbers again and establish a new higher median for each property type. Again, half the buildings in the city will be on the list and need to comply. And then that will repeat for BEPS 3 and so on. Next slide, please. All right, perfect. So compliance cycles. Let's see. I'm sorry. We went too fast. Back to the diagonal line going down. So back like 3 slides. 1, 2, perfect, right here. Just the point of this slide is to let you know that starting with BEPS 2, it's going to apply to buildings over 25,000 square feet, and BEPS 3, it drops all the way down to buildings over 10,000 square feet. Okay, what happens if you end up on the compliance list? Well, you enter a compliance cycle. Yeah, next slide now, please. Perfect. So compliance cycles were supposed to be 5 years, but due to the pandemic, the public health emergency, the BEPS wasn't delayed, but it was extended. So this first compliance cycle, instead of being 5 years, will be 6 years. Keep in mind though, 6 years isn't really the full story, because the last year is going to be the performance period. So you really have to have your improvements completed so that they're all showing up on the last year's data. Okay. What does compliance mean? Well, there's 4 pathways, right? The performance path is the default. This is the whole idea of the BEPS, right? It's supposed to be a building performance standard. So the goal is to reduce your energy use by 20% against the baseline. Not a lot of paperwork needed here, right? You just have to submit your Energy Star score. The BEPS does require that every 3 years that score is audited by a third party, but that's it. Did you reduce your score by 20% against your baseline? Yes or no? The second path is a lot more complicated. This is the prescriptive path. DOEE, when they release their rules soon, that's going to give us clarity on exactly how the prescriptive path is going to work. But the gist of it is that DOEE will award points for certain projects or O&M measures, and the intent is that if a property completes X points and documents it accordingly, then that property is deemed compliant for that compliance cycle. The standard target pathway is a new concept. This is pretty cool. So this is going to be popular for properties that fall just short of the threshold, right? If your building was a 68 and the threshold's a 70, saving 20% on a 68 is tough, right? It's a lot harder than if your building was like a 20 or something, right? So the standard target pathway means all you have to do is get your score up to that threshold. All right, so that's a lot easier, but keep in mind, if you choose this route, you can expect to be on the compliance list again in BEPS 2 because the median will have moved and you're going to be on the compliance list again. And the last pathway is a wild card. This pathway is going to include routes for compliance for corner cases, like a multi-building campus. And it's going to have special incentives. Like if you're considering a deep retrofit, where you're going to place the skin in your building and new HVAC, and you think you're going to save 40% or more, then DOEE might grant you compliance for BEPS 1 and BEPS 2 if you complete that project by a certain year. So there's going to be special routes in that last pathway. So what's next? DOEE is expected to release the rules any day now. They're past due. They're in the mayor's office. They're progressing letters of approval. Once they're released, they'll be subject to a 60-day public comment period. So we anticipate this to happen really soon. When that happens, AOBA will take the lead in gathering input from its members to address the rules and to make comments. We still don't know the exact fine or the penalty structure. I think that's one of the most common questions. DOE is kind of kept that behind the curtain. So we'll see that when the rules are released. We do know that the law states that the penalty should be large enough to encourage compliance, right? And then the last thing I wanted to just let everybody know about is DOEE, and thank you DOE for sharing some of your slides with me. They host a webinar each month regarding BEPS. The next one scheduled to be for the 10th. By then, the rules are anticipated to be out for public comment. So this could be a really good session to hear new information. And if you want to register for that webinar, just check out the AOBA event website. It has all the webinars and links to register. That's it, Wes.
Thank you, Joe. That was highly informative, and we really appreciate it. And of course, we always enjoy a nice plug of the AOBA website. We always appreciate that around these parts. And with that, I will go ahead, unless we have any questions from the audience for Joe, we can go ahead and turn it over to Lindsay, Jackie, and Eric for the discussion.
So Wes, thank you so much for having us here with you today. And Joe, thank you for the overview of the district's building energy performance standards, which really does set the stage for a lot of the conversation to follow. Before we begin the panel discussion, I want to introduce the Building Innovation Hub, since we are a new entity here in DC, created specifically to support local building industry professionals through these regulatory changes, while also balancing the market forces that are changing what is and will be considered, business as usual. Next slide. So my name is Lindsay Falaska. I'm the director of the Building Innovation Hub. The hub is here to support the local building industry and make it easier for everyone to own and operate and design and build, frankly, better performing buildings. So we're here to help meet current needs you guys have around regulatory changes, like breaking down the implications of the building energy performance standards, outlining code changes, and to provide resources around the issues that the market is currently focused on, like health and wellness. So our goal is to not just provide information about these topics, but outline how and where they all connect and explain what options are available to you in order to address them. Next slide. So in order to do that, we're providing resources and tools and educational events like this one to help you make improvements to your buildings. We are certainly here to help you overcome today's hurdles, but our job is to also help everyone look at the long-term implications of decisions that are being made. So next slide. So this mission leads into why we are here today, which is to discuss how DC's commercial building owners and operators are thinking about addressing their buildings today to respond to the current pandemic, while also keeping in mind the long-term implications of the BEPS legislation that Joe was talking about. So next slide. So to have that conversation, I am joined here today with Jackie Duke, the Senior Vice President of Operations at Brookfield Properties, and also the President of AOBA, and also Eric Tilden, the Director of Sustainability at Cushman & Wakefield. So I'd like to welcome them and thank them for joining us today. And with that, we will kick off the actual discussion portion. So we can close the slides if you want. So the reason we are gathered here today is to talk through what DC's building industry professionals are doing now to help our community endure and bounce back from COVID-19 safely, while also setting up people's buildings for long-term success. So Jackie, from an ownership perspective, what changes are you seeing during this time of disrupted occupancy? What has been your biggest surprise to date, biggest lesson learned? And then Eric, I'll ask you to respond to the same question from a property management perspective.
Thanks, Lindsay. That's biggest surprises in 2020 is a loaded question, but I would say the biggest surprise is how long this has lasted and the immediate impact to certain tenants and the industry like retail and parking. I don't think any of us expected the impact that the pandemic would have on our lives or the industry. When we left our offices in March, I think most of us thought we'd be back in a month. Then we thought June, then we thought maybe after 4th of July, then Labor Day. It's just nothing like I've ever experienced in my career, and I have a pretty long career. The closest thing I can compare to is from an operations perspective is 9/11. We've all had to learn so much in a short period of time, and it's constantly changing. I'm using words in my vocabulary that I never did, like antimicrobial and pathogens and bipolar ionization. I'd say the biggest lesson learned for me is not to react or jump quickly into investing in new procedures or technology. What we've seen is that a lot of what we put in place 5 months ago may change or even go away by the time we see real occupancy. There are new technologies coming out every day, and I think it's really wise to take our time and do our due diligence before we invest in them.
Yeah, I want to just kind of emphasize that point that Jackie made. As we look at our portfolio here in DC and nationally, we're really looking at ensuring we have solid operations, and we're going back to basics about a lot of these things. We're optimizing what we have, but we're not jumping the gun on implementing vastly different technologies in the buildings quite yet, because again, we don't know how the world will change, and a lot of this stuff is new and has not been really tested in the real world. And we kind of recognize the fact that if it works in a lab, it might not work in a commercial office setting. There's a big difference between those two, experiments. And so really something to think about in long-term investment, but don't run out and change everything and start from scratch. That's something we certainly are promoting is being smart and effective about it. One of the biggest surprises from the property management side, I would probably say, and I've talked to a lot of my property management colleagues about this, is really the collaboration and ownership. I mean, obviously it's 2020, it's a very weird year. There's nothing normal about it. But one of the things that really stood out on the property management side was the fact about how many owners were working together to find a best solution that was effective for everybody. So it was not, in a very competitive industry, owners and property management companies were coming together to say, hey, what can we do best? And what is a standardized process based off of everybody's best practices about how we can be most effective in keeping people safe and healthy. And another kind of surprise, I shouldn't say surprise because it's not a negative, but a very positive one that a lot of our property teams in DC and nationally have noted is ownership's dedication to keeping people employed. So obviously there are tenants not in the buildings, there's occupancies very low. But we've seen ownership across the board making real efforts to not reduce staff, but redirect individuals, even contractors. Like, we see janitorial staff moving into more light maintenance in order for that janitorial staff to maintain employment during this very difficult time where a lot of people have become unemployed. So I don't want to say it was a surprise, but it was. We were definitely taken aback as a property management company to see how owners really were generous, for lack of a better word, or really dedicated and focused to keeping the people and the subcontractors at their properties employed, even during the shift work and all that stuff. That was probably one of our biggest surprises. And again, lesson learned. We're definitely learning how to be more flexible in the operations of our properties, both as property managers and as engineers. And so understanding how our buildings really operate and the capabilities and how we can be flexible when this occupancy is high in some floors and low in others, really assessing in the building about how can we change our strategies real time and really interact with our tenants to best serve them and keep them comfortable as people still come into buildings, but also reduce our energy use.
So when we were doing this prep call for this webinar, you both surprised me by mentioning this industry collaboration. So I'm glad you brought it up, because in a highly competitive market, you're seeing everyone come together and saying, we all have to tackle this together, like sink or swim, it's all of us. So I do appreciate that perspective that people have come together. As a side note, I also would love to see that happen once we come on the other side of this and start thinking about building performance, how the industry needs to come together to tackle it in a similar way. Which brings me to the next question. Energy use has remained comparatively high and mostly vacant commercial office buildings, or I should at least say that energy use hasn't dropped to match the level of vacancy. How can owners address this pandemic as the pandemic continues and as occupancy remains below the norm? What kind of business or operational strategies are you guys putting in place to help curb operational utility costs?
Jackie, you want to go first?
Sure. So yeah, you're right. The reality is that buildings are still open and we're still conditioning them. And the steps we've taken for the virus often run counter to energy efficiency. So we're seeing about a savings of about 20% in utilities. And it's not the kind of savings we might have expected to see. I mean, we typically figure about 45 to 50% fixed versus variable costs in utilities when we're planning for that. When I talk to my engineers, they're surprised we aren't seeing a bigger impact from plug load. But again, it's because we're operating our buildings, because we have to keep our outside air at a maximum, because we can't use demand control, because we're increasing our filtration. But what it has shown us, and at least it's a learning experience where the loads are, and it's allowed us to evaluate our buildings in a different way. And we've done things, I mean, we have done some things to get energy as low as we can while we operate, things like adjusting set points, checking tenant spaces for lights and other things left on, and made adjustments to things like amenity spaces and common areas. But I feel like that's what we're kind of limited to while we operate the building. Sorry, Eric, go ahead.
No, I think that's a great response. We see the same thing. I mean, we work in multi-tenanted buildings primarily. So unlike an office, for instance, that Amazon owns the building and Amazon is the sole occupant, they can really regulate their energy usage because they really regulate the folks in the building. We're a multi-tenanted world here in DC. And so to Jackie's point, people are still coming into the office. I mean, we see occupancies as low as 5%, as high as 20%, but there are still bodies in buildings, and those spaces need to be conditioned and operating to keep those tenants satisfied and able to keep on working on their daily jobs. So one of the things we definitely are promoting and our property managers are utilizing is just communication. Communication, communication, communication. Know what your tenants are doing. Know when they are in the building, if they're adjusting their hours being in the building. Every tenant's different. Understanding how the buildings work as far as controls strategies. So are you able to turn off zones? There's a lot of buildings in DC that are older stock, and it's not necessarily zoned, or was never really zoned in a way where if you have folks in certain spaces, you can shut down those spaces. A lot of these buildings are all or nothing. You know, a lot of spaces, like you have to run the base building equipment, you know, in a lot of spaces almost full speed to satisfy minor occupancy. So we're really focusing on understanding what are the flexibilities of the existing equipment and the BAS systems in these buildings, and then communicating with tenants and having a back and forth, understanding, you know, are there opportunities to save energy? How many hours will you actually be in the building? How many people? What floors are you consolidating on floors? And this is really especially important as people will start to come back into the building, because they're probably going to come back in shifts. A squad, B squad, and that's what we're seeing. So really understanding what every tenant is doing and being able to readjust our engineering strategy by space in the building wherever possible. And if that's not possible, how can we make some minor improvements to make that possible so that we have better control?
I think the thing that interests me about this conversation is that folks are scrutinizing their systems. They're looking at the way they perform and how they're operating from a health and wellness perspective with more detail than maybe people had been able to before. And so because people are in their buildings and looking at their systems and looking at their operations from a health and wellness perspective, we also want to make sure that people are looking at these systems for building energy performance improvement opportunities as well, knowing that, as Joe mentioned, the building energy performance standards are coming into effect very, very soon. And so what opportunities exist during this period of low, or additional opportunities, I should say, exist during this period of low occupancy? How should building owners and property managers, or just various buildings, look at evaluating these different opportunities to understand the balance between, you know, additional outside air versus energy consumption?
Jackie, you want to start?
Sure. So if you know building engineers, they're constantly looking for energy efficiency savings. If they had their way, you know, things would probably be dark when people walked in the morning, just to save energy. So beyond what we've already talked about, adjusting set points, we will continue to do those things. It's a great opportunity, and we talked about this before this meeting, to get projects done while tenants aren't in spaces, and we're doing a lot of that. But what I see that's really valuable from this is, in your right, Lindsay, it gives us a way to look at the building differently, to have this low occupancy. We've never kind of had this viewpoint of it. And it brings up a lot of good questions, like what does the future look like? You know, for example, if the future is more flexible schedules and therefore less people on a regular basis, how should we look at designing our systems so they're more flexible? So that we're only conditioning the space when they're in. Does Friday start to look like Saturday? You know, most of us have gone to this Saturday hours concept. We've been doing that for a long time, where it's available to tenants, but it's by request. So does it start to look like more like that in the future? So those, I feel like, are really interesting conversations that we haven't had before.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll hit on controls and flexibility is one of the main things that we focus on right now. So making sure, using your existing BAS system, building automation system, how are we able to improve the control strategies to accommodate a lower occupancy? And there's a lot of easy things that you could probably work with controls contractors with and implement that BASs today may already be designed to do, or minor upgrades might be able to do it. You don't have to overhaul the whole system. You can tweak it in a way with some smart programming and some code that other people write way smarter than myself to be able to improve those systems. A lot of things we're seeing are things like Vab Retro Commissioning. So we're doing that in-house. Like, being able to touch VAV boxes in tenant spaces during, regular hours because the space is vacant. It doesn't take after hours anymore. You don't have to pay overtime. So making sure that we're doing some sort of in-house retro commissioning to make sure all of the equipment and the hardware and software is talking to each other, reviewing strategies like discharge air reset controls, which I'm going to get a little nerdy as the engineering side, but making sure that our units in the buildings are accommodating to the occupancy and the load and not just simply on off. Installing variable frequency drives to really, again, provide the opportunity for flexibility of ramping things up and down as occupancy increases and decreases. Because to Jackie's point, I mean, no one has a crystal ball of what the commercial office world will look like in the next 12 to 24 months. If occupancy will increase or decrease, or if it will be sort of like, again, the Saturday syndrome where, you have people on Fridays leaving the office. And we're also seeing some of the hardware things like lighting retrofits. Again, if this is an after hours activity typically because they're in tenant spaces, now you have an opportunity to do it during regular commercial hours for a cheaper cost. And in a lot of cases, sometimes the building engineer is doing some easy lighting retrofits because they have less hot and cold calls now. And so they don't have to respond to tenant concerns so much. So it's definitely a cost-effective way of improving the building.
And so one of the other strategies that we had talked about doing the prep is how you guys are looking at addressing both health and wellness alongside energy consumption. And so it's the need to really balance both and sort of understand the regulatory requirements alongside of the, when occupants are demanding health as part of their space. So I was wondering if you guys could talk about how you guys are able to balance this need, what strategies you're finding that really do or can address both, even if you're implementing it for health now, how might it actually benefit energy performance in the future?
So for me, one of the hardest pills I've had to swallow through this is that, and people keep saying this to me, that I need to put sustainability aside until we get through this pandemic. Although we're saving because of low occupancy, again, most everything recommended for the virus from an HVAC standpoint goes against efficiency, like higher filtration, maximum OA, running the buildings for longer hours, not using demand control ventilation, not to mention all the PPE that we're putting out in the world. So once I get past that, and we've been in crisis mode, frankly, and probably haven't focused on efficiency like we should. But the good news is, I think we're seeing technology advancing that was kind of out there and we were all thinking about, but didn't really know what to do about it. But it's advancing for COVID. But I think there are things like sensors, occupancy sensors, IAQ sensors, for example, a lot of apps that they're developing for use for COVID that we're going to be using for efficiency in the future. So I think that's happened a lot faster because of COVID. And I think in the long run, we're going to just develop strategies for both. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We see a lot of interest nationally amongst our owners and our tenants about indoor air quality sensors, real-time sensors, getting that data about the air quality moving forward. And no, it does not measure if COVID is in the air, but yes, it measures a lot of parameters which determine the quality of the air itself. And these are all parameters that are part of the LEED and the WELL programs. And so having that in real time, real data, and the fact that they're so easily deployable and portable, you can move them around the building. You can have them in spaces that might be difficult spaces to treat for air quality or test any spaces if somebody has a concern, in conference rooms and things like that. And they're pretty cost effective. And again, the technology is getting cheaper and lighter and more deployable, and the Internet of Things makes it wireless and it all talks to each other and it can integrate with the BAS system. So we're going to see a lot more of that, I believe, in the next few years. But Jackie's absolutely right. We're running systems more to ventilate, per ASHRAE standards and keeping people safe. One of the things that we're really looking at is, as building operators, sequences of operations. So yes, we have to ventilate, for a duration of time after the building is unoccupied, but we're looking at how can we, shut down the outdoor air unit and then treat the air to heat the building back up and then start to introduce outdoor air before people come back in, so that you're not conditioning outdoor air all the time when you're ventilating spaces where there's no occupancy. And again, that's a control strategy. That's looking at your existing equipment and tweaking it a bit to make sure you can do that strategy. It's not, necessarily overhauling anything. It's utilizing what you have and possibly investing a little bit to make it better at this point in time. But that's a big one. I mean, it's especially in the DC area, it costs a lot to condition the outside air in the winter and the summer. So if you do have these ventilation requirements, how can we not or pull back the conditioning of that air to flush the building out and then recondition the building as easily and cost effectively as possible, and then introduce outdoor air again, so that make sure people feel safe and are safe with outdoor air controls. And that's just a sequence of operations things. And those sort of opportunities are things we're really looking at that do combine. How can we help health and wellness and ensure health and wellness while also, reducing energy use through those strategies? Longer term, we have a lot more buildings looking at energy recovery systems. If you're going to be introducing more and more outdoor air, how can you recover the energy to precondition that air before it enters the building through enthalpy wheels and items like that? And so there's definitely more of an interest there as people understand that, outdoor air takes a lot to condition in this region of the country. And how can we get some of that energy back before it leaves the building?
What I really appreciate about both of your perspectives on how you're looking at your buildings is it's very much making the most with what you have. It's not these sort of capital intensive projects where you're sort of doing major things, but it's really about analyzing how your systems are operating, what's possible with your systems, and then what cost affordable things can actually be done to both address health and energy. And so that actually, Eric, you have a nice segue into the next question, which is about what are the changing trends for all commercial buildings that are informing about how you're thinking about the future of your property. So you touched on, energy recovery, vehicles, and the Internet of Things. So I'm curious, as we sort of move forward and look towards the future, what trends are you guys seeing or anticipating that will come into play?
Jackie.
Sorry. Well, I want to first start by saying that I think I work for a company that invests a lot in its property, so I have the luxury of having a lot of good systems in place that I can work with, sophisticated BMS systems. I don't think that's true for everyone, and those are the properties that probably are going to have a bigger challenge in this world. But as far as going forward, I just, all these things are going to be priorities. Even though COVID's kind of taken our eye off the ball on sustainability and efficiency for a moment, in the end, it's just going to be part of how we design and operate going forward. And if you look at history, technology and change come from situations like this. And we're just going to get smarter, and technology is going to get smarter to address all these things. And I think they're going to work, like we talked about, with data and IoT. It's all going to work together, and we're going to adjust to it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Jackie. I think health, again, will be a priority, and it will continue to be a priority, and data will be a big part of that. Data about the quality of the air and data about cleaning and all of that stuff. Data is definitely going to be there. People will move more towards the Internet of Things, not only just sensors, but touchless items, touchless everything. In restrooms, going with touchless, fixtures and fittings with amenities, having, touchless amenity spaces more and more. The sensors will grow. We'll definitely be seeing that. We have buildings that have occupancy and density sensors so that we can shut down or pull back spaces that are unoccupied from the HVAC system. Similar to how you do it with a lighting sensor now. No one's in there, why are you keeping it lit? So if no one's in there, why are you conditioning it to an occupied space temp when you can pull that space temp back and save energy? And then through a lot of meeting systems now, people book rooms and we can precondition that space again to make it comfortable, while also not over conditioning that space, especially when it comes to these locally controlled, like water source heat pumps we see in buildings still. somebody sets it to 80 and walks out the door, you know? And so like, how can we pull that back and prevent that while also maintaining tenant comfort and tenant health? I think sensors and the Internet of Things will definitely grow. And I really want to also emphasize Jackie's point about the big owners have a lot of the resources and the backing and the people on their staff to look at smart and effective strategies for their buildings. There's a lot of single building owners, there's a lot of smaller owners that don't have necessarily the staff or the resources that we have. And that's why I think the items like the hub are so important, because they're going to be going out and leaning on some advice from others, sort of like how all of the owners meet for their COVID club to talk about best strategies about COVID. That's going to move forward with BEPS, I would hope, and I think the hub would be a big part of that. Because, I mean, in all honesty, there's going to be people who own buildings that are going to be, for lack of a better word, preyed upon by technology vendors and marketing individuals, and, you know, hey, you should install this and it's going to cost you this much and your system will be better, where, you know, what you really want is the resources for them to say, hey, what is truly best for my building? What is the most cost effective and physically effective strategy I could implement? What are my opportunities? There's just, we've seen from the property management side a plethora of marketing material come out talking about this and that and design and technology, and it's a lot to digest, and it's a lot to understand what applies to your building and what is the best strategy for your building. And so unless you have the resources to do that, a lot of times you get lost. And so I think that's why it's important to have these sort of conversations in the hub.
I appreciate the plug, Eric. Absolutely. That's certainly what we're here to do, is help people, because there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of information, and there's a lot that's possible, and it's hard to know who's upselling versus who's telling you the truth versus sort of what action is actually right for you, even if it was right for your peer building or a building across the street. So there's a lot of potential things out there that we are certainly happy to help people with, especially recovering from this. I do think you guys need a new name besides COVID Club. But I do appreciate the intent behind the industry coming together to address this problem. It just sounds like a super spreader event.
Yeah, no, it's terrible, but there's a story behind that. So, but
I am sure there is. It's just the first thing.
Yeah, it's kind of tongue in cheek.
Of course it is. Well, with that, I want to thank Eric and Jackie for their contributions, and I would like to open it up to the audience for questions. If someone would like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand with that button. If not, you can put it in the chat. Alexandra Laney is on cue to sort of read any questions that have popped up from the chat. And so I will now turn it over to Alex to see if there's any questions that have come through.
I don't see any questions yet, but I'll just give everyone a moment to reflect. Here's one from Margaret Jeffers. So let me just figure out how to unmute you, Margaret.
Hi, Peggy.
I don't know how to override it. Margaret.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me, yes. Okay. So this is a question about your tenants. Are you hearing requests from your customers, your tenants, about what you are doing in the wellness area to make them feel comfortable about returning to the office? Is that something that is included in your communications to your tenant groups?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've tried to be proactive about it. We've had town halls with our tenants. We've had our property managers in constant contact with them. We have a return to work guide that tells them everything we're doing. So yes, I would be surprised if everybody isn't doing the same.
Yeah, same here. I mean, every building, every tenant's different, but one of the things that we really push across the board is communication. You know, understanding what the building is doing, and we have had tenants reach out and ask too for more details. What strategies are you taking? And we're happy to supply all and any information to make you feel comfortable, and what we're doing in our best practices. to have people feel safe and be safe when coming back into these buildings.
And as a follow-up to that, in addition to what you're doing with your building systems, are people asking for a redesign, like plexiglass put in between workstations, that type of thing?
I would say that really, again, tenant dependent. Like people are definitely implementing those strategies in their tenant spaces themselves. Base building, we're certainly spacing people out and implementing strategies in all common areas, and corridors, and elevators, and if you have any amenity spaces, how can we keep everybody safe and implement any sort of strategies that are requested by tenants to help make everybody feel safe. But when it comes to like plexiglass between workstations, that tends to be more of a tenant implementation item.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I could tag on to that, right? So I think something that we're getting, likewise, we're getting a lot of these requests from tenants about what we're doing, to make the the building safer. And one of the things we're working on now is, the certifications or, credentials that you can, hang on your building, to, make everybody know, all right, well, it might not mean it's free of COVID, but we know, third-party verified, this building is, has been examined and passed some level of rigor, right? And so there's a lot of these right now, that there's, well has been out, it's hard to get, but it's well established. Fitwell's newer, easier to get. And then, UL, I think everybody recognizes the UL brand. They've come out with a new program, Verified Healthy Buildings Checkmark, that is, if you've already kind of been on, regular water and air testing programs, it's easy to kind of piggyback this on top of, and, they're looking at, they're giving you, a check mark that verifies that you've passed, certain levels of rigor with your janitorial efficacy and your HVAC maintenance. And I think the UL brands will recognize. So I think like getting each building the spot where we've got a verified kind of third-party answer to some of those questions is part of our strategy to bring in tenants' peace of mind about return to the office.
So obviously tenant retainage is a huge issue now that everyone's focused on. So I'm curious, out of all the strategies you guys listed, is there one that bubbles up that you find has been the most well received or the most in demand from tenants? Or is it really about this comprehensive, you need a little bit of everything approach?
I would say a little bit of everything. I don't think there's any one thing. And I will say tenants, everybody, the world is more educated about this. We get questions about, HVAC, air, aerosolation of the virus. They know about MERV 15 filters, more than they ever did before. So we get all kinds of questions.
Yeah, we run the gamut. It's a little bit of everything. So it's also tenant specific. But yeah, we see questions on a diversity of items.
I think the MERV 13 question has been the most frequent, at least that I've seen, because when these client groups hire, if they have like a health person in their office or if they hire a consultant, these people are looking back to ASHRAE guidelines, and ASHRAE guidelines, like there's not, Google it, right? There's not a lot there. And it says, it talks about MERV 13, and the tricky spot is how you interpret that kind of guideline as it relates to, there's a lot of filters in the building. So like, they're not necessarily talking about put MERV 13 on everything, right? And so kind of, the nuances or interpretations of like that, ASHRAE guidance vis-a-vis MERV 13 has been like kind of like the most common, kind of conversation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, ventilation in general is definitely way up there. We get questions about design outdoor air percentage for buildings. What's the flexibility of that? Can you adjust that? And then like people translating it to how many air changes are occurring in the building. Things like that. As people become tenants, become way more educated through the ASHRAE guidance on the engineering aspects of building engineering.
Yeah, and it's changed. At the beginning, it felt like all we were talking about was touchless. People wanted to know what we were doing in elevators and how they could be safe in elevators. And then when the CDC came out and updated and started talking more about HVAC, then that flipped. And we've really made a concerted effort too to educate our leasing people, because it's coming in through the brokers too, that they're getting all these questions from prospective tenants. So we've all had to learn a lot.
Yeah.
It makes sense that it's like a full hands-on deck, right? Every sort of stakeholder that touches building now has to become at least a mild expert in all of these different system strategies that are coming into play, because there are certainly a lot more questions than there are answers that are probably flying around right now. Alex, I wanted to ask you if there were any other questions that popped up in the chat.
Can I go ahead and ask one while we're waiting there, Lindsay? I got one from the panel here.
You're the host. You can ask whatever you want.
Well, no, I was just hearing the discussion and hearing Jackie and Eric talk about, you know, we haven't seen the energy savings that we might have thought from the lack of occupancy, but there has been a drop to some degree because of the lack of occupancy. And then on the multifamily side, I would assume that energy consumption has shot through the roof with everybody being at home. And given that BEPS is kind of built off of a foundation of benchmarking, is there any concern about this year being kind of haywire and a little different than every other year, and how that might be treated in a BEPS regime? I mean, I guess that's for
totally. No, Wes, you're 1000% right. So the BOE is still playing with it a little bit. The original plan was for the you know, your 2019 score was going to implicate where you stand versus the threshold, right? And then your benchmark was supposed to be that like a 2-year average of your 19 plus 20 performance, right? And that sets your benchmark, and then that would be compared against where you'd land in a 2-year performance period at the end of the compliance zone. The pandemic has like changed all that, right? So now it's going to be a 6-year cycle. The performance period is only 1 year at the end, and then the benchmark at the beginning is it's not going to be 19 plus 20 automatically. For what they're thinking about doing is, and now this is none of this is established yet, right? What they're thinking about doing is making it, giving people the option. You can your benchmark could be 18 plus 19, which is what you'd want to do for office, right? You don't want to include like this like low score zone into your benchmark. That'll make it harder to get compliance, right? So 18 plus 19, and then resi, you know, multifamily might want to do, you know, 19 plus 20, right? I'm sorry. So office would want to do 18 and 19. Multifamily would want to do 19 and 20. And so that, you know, their benchmark is higher, right? Or you know, their score is lower, you know, their usage is higher, so easier to reduce. So, you know, the DOE is looking at how they're going to, maybe they just land on no games, it's just your 19 performance, that's your benchmark. So, you know, there's a couple things on the table. There's definitely awareness. You can't, can't count 20, you know, just on face value is being part of your benchmark.
Yeah, and Wes, we've seen this, to your point about the switch in energy usage from commercial to residential. We've seen that nationally. So like across the DC portfolio for commercial office, we've seen about 20-25% drop in our energy usage. Now, to tell you a story, in New York City, generally, I'm sure everybody knows what demand response is. In New York City, Manhattan has a demand response, or Con Ed has a demand response program. Or commercial office buildings in Manhattan, typically they send out a signal. We have, you know, too much on the grid. Can you lower down your loads? Demand response, and that hits the Manhattan commercial area in the summertime. This year, Con Ed asked Brooklyn to do it because everybody was working from home, and their grid in Manhattan was fine, but the grid in Brooklyn was struggling, and so they sent out a demand response to Brooklyn area. And good luck having every resident turn off their air conditioning or lower it in the summer, or try to adhere to a demand response program. So it was something Con Ed was almost on brownout because they had just never seen a residential load like that in the New York City area. So
It
to
is
shift.
fascinating to hear how people are starting to shift from sort of the way up at the utility level all the way down to the resident level. It's certainly a lot to contend with. Alex noted that there was another question from the audience.
Yeah, I'd like to recognize Todd Anderson. So Todd, if you want to go ahead and try to unmute yourself.
That was pretty easy. I just pressed a button, but
Technology for the win.
Thank you guys for really a great webinar. The question I have, and maybe you all can answer it, Jackie may be able to add a little bit more to it. I'm just curious, how do you guys see COVID kind of affecting new lease language in the future? Jackie kind of touched on it a little bit. You know, there's standard language in leases. So does that change with, like, you know, do building standards change, whatnot? So, and obviously this is on the commercial side. So just was kind of curious what you kind of thought moving forward.
It's a big question. I hear a lot of people talking about a lot of things that they want to add to leases. Honestly, I think the leasing market's going to be very soft for a while. So adding anything is going to be difficult. From my perspective, what I was talking about was more flexible for HVAC, but I've heard people throw things out about insurance and, you know, all kinds of other language protecting landlords. We haven't honestly made any changes to date. I'm sure they will happen.
Yeah, same. Todd, I recognize that voice, sir.
Yeah, Eric.
Same. We see more leasing language discussion in the New York City area right now because of local law 97 and the greenhouse gas law, and the fact that New York by 2025 is going to mandate all tenants are sub-metered for their energy usage. So there's a lot of lease language around that because buildings, I mean, the tenants obviously play a huge part in your energy usage beyond the base building systems. And so now, you know, one way New York City's tackling that is by mandating that energy used by tenants is measured for every building across the city, so that ownership and tenants can collaborate about how they can effectively reduce energy usage. But obviously that trickles into the lease language.
I wish they would do that here, honestly. I would really love to have tenants sub-metered, and we really struggle in this market. Most every market that we're in, and every major market, tenants are sub-metered. And the next level of energy efficiency is tenants. I mean, what do we figure? They take up 60% of the building usage. So we can do a lot on the common area side, but the next step is really them and giving them ownership of it.
And like with TI dollars, they tend to go to more aesthetic things than LED retrofits or HVAC and stuff like that. So, you know, bringing those TI dollars into energy improvements is a big thing right now in like New York language, New York City lease language.
Yeah. Yeah. Our current system doesn't incentivize them to stay. I mean, not to save on energy and conserve.
It really does make the case for, you know, regulation, right? And in government, you know, intervention. You know, we were in a tenant market before all of this, you know, now we're, you know, highest vacancy rates in DC history, right? So it's, you know, you couldn't, you know, the idea of like pushing green lease language, right? You know, in such a tenant favorable market where it's such a knife fight to get a lease signed is, you know, it's kind of a dubious concept, but like, I think New York and DC, you know, they've got their own clubs, right? And so DC and New York are friends, right? And I think we've been, you know, taking pages from their playbook. And yeah, I think that you know, the market isn't going to go there. Landlords aren't going to volunteer to make their buildings less competitive against the competition, right? So, you know, people want to do the right thing and be as efficient as possible, but you know, an empty building is really inefficient, right? So, you know, we've got to get them leases done.
No, that makes a lot of sense. There's certainly a lot of lessons learned to be from New York and other cities as various regulations take effect. And with that, since we're almost at time, I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. I'd like to thank Wes, Joe, Jackie, and Eric for participating. And a special thank you to AOBA and AOBA Educational Foundation for their partnership in putting this webinar together. There was a slide up earlier with all of our contact information in case anyone would like to follow up or has any questions. I would also like to encourage all of you to go to the Hub's website to check out the different resources we've developed to help you navigate a lot of these changes. And frankly, look for other events that we're planning to line up, and we're looking forward to doing some more specific things around the multifamily housing sector as well, since there's a lot happening in that sector as well. And with that, Wes, are there any closing remarks that you'd like to add before we officially close down for lunch?
I think you covered it quite well, Lindsay. I just want to say thanks to you, Jackie, Eric, and Joe. I thought it was an informative event for me as part of the panel. So thanks to all of you for a great event.
Lots of good lessons learned. So thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.